Well, you're listening to Rebuilders.
We have a jam-packed session today.
Yeah, we do.
We are going to ask the question, how do we read culture from a biblical perspective? But how do we do that at a time when there just seems to be more ideologies than ever before? So today we're going to ask the question, how do we look at all these things like libertarianism, critical theory, Joe Rogan, kangaroo meat, utilitarianism, liberalism, conspiracy theories? How do we look at all these different things and things which may be present amongst our friends, our family, if you're a leader, perhaps in the people you lead, perhaps in the congregation you're preaching to? How do you actually understand these things from a biblical perspective, and how do we tell the one true story of the gospel in such challenging times?
Great. And as always, if you want to know more about the books or articles that we reference in the episode, you can subscribe to our mailing list by going to rebuilders.co. Let's get into it. Hi, welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark. How you going?
I'm doing well. Although
Great.
I must say our pastry game is pretty bad today. Ooh. You and I have nothing. Daniel has a
like a 4-day
microwaved 4-day-old croissant. We had our first service back on the weekend, we had pastries for all and sundry.
Yes.
And but it makes me feel like I have to confront something. We've been talking about diagnosing and how the gospel critiques our culture as well.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a really dangerous question at this point in time?
Well, I don't know.
If it's pastry related, I won't.
We're now out of lockdown here in Melbourne town and hitting, going to hit 93, 94% vaccination. So we're in a good place. But I must ask the question, were pastries our coping mechanism for being the world's most lockdown city? Boom.
Were we self-medicating through pastries?
Were we self-medicating through staggeringly good pastries?
And some staggeringly awful gingerbread.
Well, I think that's when I start to question things.
As your elected member for parliament, I'm ashamed of my constituency.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And the very left turn you've taken.
Well, it's not left turn, it's a populist anti-big donut turn we're taking.
Well, I'm holding strong. I'm staying true to the pastry course.
Yeah, but look what you're eating, man.
Yeah.
I know. It's
staying true to the pastry course.
I just don't know what to believe
with
anymore.
Your stale, buttery
next year's a new year. What if we look forward in anticipation of what mascot we'll have as
I think we should have kangaroo steaks.
I'm not eating kangaroo steaks on a Wednesday morning.
If you're watching this on YouTube.
Just to freak out our international listeners who don't realise that people do eat kangaroo.
It's quite a lean meat.
It's a very lean meat, and it's a sustainable meat.
It's quite good.
Yeah. All right, next year on the electric frying pan on your desk, on your sound desk there, Daniel, and you can be flipping us.
Cooking show component of our...
the lean, two-legged hopping. We'll eat our national symbol.
Did you know, just a little side note, there's a pub in Fitzroy that does a parma. For those of you listening that don't know what a parma is, it's like a chicken parmigiana, but we call it a parma here in Victoria. Apparently other places
in South Australia.
Good on you.
Represent.
But instead of doing ham, it has like thinly sliced kangaroo.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's actually quite good. I really like it. So, we'll have a Rebuilders outing.
Before?
I've not had crocodile.
No.
Nor have I.
Have you had emu?
No.
I think I have once. I don't remember what it was like though.
Have you had horse?
No.
No. Is that venison's?
Not knowingly.
Deer.
Yeah. I have. It wasn't great. Okay. So moving on. The last few episodes we have been, exploring how to read culture, how to take a step back from living in this very confusing world at times and observing what our culture is all about, how it's formed, and how do we respond and lead in this space. So we're going to do that again today. Obviously, it is they are trying times, Mark.
They are trying times.
And how do we read our culture? We're going to kind of do that live today.
Yeah, I thought it'd be helpful to equip people
Yeah.
to understand this. And again, continue to use the wonderful frameworks given to us by Leslie Newbegin. And
our fave.
we'll put in the show notes some links to, or not the show notes. Well, I keep calling it the show notes because that's what other podcasts say. It's our subscriber email.
Yeah. Which you can get by going to rebuilders.co.
Yeah. So essentially, Newbegin saw that one of the dangers for people communicating the gospel is that they syncretize the gospel with their own culture. So in other words, that the gospel becomes bent, if you like, out of shape to suit their own idols. And that was one of the things that was seen throughout history.
Yeah.
Often the witness of the church has been blunted when our national goals, our cultural goals, our ideological goals become blurred with what the actual gospel is about. And if the gospel is the one true story and Christ is the one true king over the whole universe, therefore everything must submit to that rule and reign.
Yes.
So one of the things that Newbegin said, which I find really helpful, which is inspired me for many, many years, is the idea that every culture has what he called a hidden credo. A hidden credo. In other words, that every culture has something that it truly ultimately worships. Now, Newbegin made the really interesting point that it may not be what it says it actually worships. To give you an example, outside of our culture, communism, which, as it took off in the Soviet Union and in China, very much attempted to move beyond religion. It saw religion as the opiate of the people and was creating what it called this new materialist improvement of the world. So it wanted to get beyond worship, get beyond religion. But really interesting, you saw something develop, which was a cult of personality. Khrushchev, the Russian premier, denounced Stalin and said that a cult of personality had grown up around Stalin. And Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese premier, also tried to sort of work against the cult of personality that grew up around Chairman Mao. So what they were saying essentially was that even when communism tried to get rid of God, that still had this sense of hidden credo of worship. And even Lenin, who started the sort of Communist Party in Russia, they embalmed his body like they would embalm the ancient sort of saints of Russia, and people would go in and almost pay homage and worship to this figure. So in a sense, what Newbegin was saying is it's impossible not to be religious. Or Christopher Dawson, the sort of historian, said that culture. The word culture comes from the word cultus, which means two things: to worship and to cultivate. And Augustine said that our hearts are restless until they find their home in God. Scripture in Ecclesiastes 3:11 says that God set eternity in our hearts. So every culture has a hidden, almost religious key that we need to uncover. So the task of the church in a missionary posture, whether that's in your culture or another culture, is to diagnose the culture and find what is the hidden credo, what is the hidden foundations that culture ultimately worships, whether they say it or not.
Well, okay, arguably many people might say we live in a secular culture, which means that we aren't religious at all.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
Yeah. That's one of the big questions that Newbegin wrestled with. And his argument was that secularism ultimately was religious. The sort of claim of secularism really is, yes, it is to, you can look at secularism two ways. You can say it's to get rid of God completely, like I just shared, the communists did. But really Western secularism, as we understand, is more to have a public space, a public square, which is devoid of the influence of religion. You can still believe and worship in your own private space.
Yeah.
So if you want to go to church, do it. If you want to be a Buddhist, do it. But in the public space, in government, in the marketplace, we don't bring those values there. So what secularism in the West attempts to do is to create this content-free public space. And Newbegin said that this is an attempt to sort of, almost have no values in that space, but ultimately values creep in. There is still a religious underpinning to secular Western cultures, and that the individual, the idea that religion is not to come into the public space. Now, really interesting, Shadi Hamed wrote a book, I think it's called Islamic Exceptionalism, where he said this is one of the clashes between Islam and the West, because Islam doesn't have this divide between private and public, and that's it's actually a very Western thought to think that religion can just be this private thing, which comes from a particular time in history, German liberal Protestantism, where it sort of retreats into this personal space. So even that's a belief that ultimately the big questions can be solved by Western rationalists in the public space, and therefore religion's allowed if it takes the secondary role to the big goal. So, all this was religious sort of values. But the interesting thing is, I think that when we understand that and understand that the secular West is religious, people can, understand the secular West is religious. That helps us understand what a lot of people are really worried about the rise of secularism.
Yeah.
And see, how's the church going to face in the wave of secularism that's coming? But ultimately, I think it helps us understand that it's going to fail, and it is failing.
Yeah.
And so much of what we see in the culture war, what we see in all these different ideologies that seem to be rising now as politics seemingly becoming almost like a new religion, all of this is because the secular vision of the West has a religious underpinning, and that religious underpinning is failing at this time. Okay,
so we've touched on a number of these ideologies that are emerging within secularism over the whole time that we've been chatting on Rebuilders, but I wonder if we can maybe do as New Begin suggests and diagnose our culture and go through these ideologies that are emerging within secularism or goodness me, what is with our words today?
I think you said it right, secularism.
Did I? Secularism.
Yeah.
I feel like I missed a syllable in there. Thank you.
You did, but you corrected, so carry on.
Great. Thank you, gatekeeper. All right, so diagnosing culture. This is something that New Begin suggested that we do. Let's start.
Well, can I just give a quick setup that I failed to do?
Yep.
So there's a bunch of ideologies today.
Yep.
And all of them, in many ways, I would argue, are responses to one or more failings of our Western secular culture.
Okay.
And I would say even not just, you got to understand too that this New Begin argued that the West is the most powerful ideology in the world, and it goes beyond the West. Western ideals are shaping places like Tokyo, South Korea, Africa. It's the ideas and content that the West has is going out into the world and interacting with every culture around the world. So all of these different ideologies that we're about to talk to are actually, in some sense, responses to these failings.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah. Well, let's begin with the first one.
Okay, liberalism.
Yeah. So liberalism is probably been and again too, so this is an important one to just pass out, that people hear different things in different parts of the world. In America, liberalism is often equated with the West. In Australia, our Conservative Party is called the Liberal Party. So that's a little bit confusing for people. But
do you want to know just a funny, it's silly. When I was a kid and I didn't really care much about politics or anything. I mean, I cared about things, but not politics. Yeah. The way that I would remember what political party was in power at the time. So John Howard was our Prime Minister, and he had very liberal eyebrows, and that's how I remembered that he represented the Liberals.
That's all I knew him for as a kid.
He did have, for anyone who is perhaps listening overseas or not familiar with John Howard, his eyebrows were just a whole thing.
Weren't they?
But he obviously, there was a point in he was a very long Prime Minister. There was obviously a point in his Prime Ministership where advisors came in and they were tamed.
Oh, see,
Yeah, because they were crazy early on and then they got tamed.
I'm just looking at a photo of him now. I think part of it was he was grey, balding and grey, but then had like almost jet black.
Yeah, the eyebrows had yet to turn.
So really. Sorry, I saw another picture.
Well, I must eat humble pie because I did laugh at him back then at the eyebrows, and I noted that when I was younger. But just as I get older, I've noticed that, I don't know, there's just power goes to your eyebrows as you get older. And there's just like, I'm having to tame. My political advisors have come in and told me to tame my eyebrows. It's great. Okay. So
anyway, sorry, I digress. I just thought it was.
That was fantastic.
Yep.
So essentially liberalism, if you could, both in terms of left and right, has defined really the last 20, 30 years. So what do I mean by liberalism? I'm talking the belief in free markets, economic growth, individual freedom, that the world is going to move to everyone in the world becoming liberal democracy, democratic countries, that the invasion of Iraq, one of the justifications for it, apart from the weapons of mass destruction, is that Iraq could become a liberal democracy.
Yeah.
So this has been very much the sort of defining ideology in the world. And in many ways, this is behind consumerism, individualism. And Francis Fukuyama talked of sort of this desire to have a content-free political ideology. So the idea was that the world had gotten into problems in the 20th century because it was too religious, if you like, and too totalitarian and too passionate about politics. So let's just have this politics where we just have this freedom in the market, in places. We don't get too excited about politics, and the world's just going to become a better place slowly. And I think that this is still powerful in the world.
Yeah.
And in many ways, if you look at, some of the language around the pandemic, often people who are like, let's get the economy back on track. Let's get back to normal. Let's get back to 2019. That's very much the sort of liberal approach to this moment.
Okay. So with that in mind, as we go through diagnosing the culture, we're going to ask a few questions of these ideologies. Yeah. So can I frame them up for us before we dig into them for liberalism? We're going to ask, what is the sin or sin of liberalism?
Yeah.
Or what does it perceive as the sin of the culture?
Yes.
Yeah. What is redemption, and then what is worshipped? So when we look at liberalism, we're asking, what does it see as the sin of the culture, and what is it aiming to fix? What is the redemption? So what is the way that it's going to bring,
salvation. Really.
Salvation, yes. Yeah, great. I mean, not great, but and then what is worshipped? Yeah. What does liberalism herald as the almighty thing?
Yeah. So and these are really helpful questions that people can apply outside of just these solutions.
Yes,
you can ask this about your city, you can ask this about perhaps other ideologies we don't talk about today, your nationality, your region, whatever, your culture.
Yeah.
So really with liberalism, I think the big problem it sees with the world is a lack of material goods. So it sees that, one of the big problems in the world is that people live in poverty and they need their, material goods. Is there some truth in that? Yes. Going back to what we did 2 weeks ago, there's a biblical yes and a no.
Yes.
And so, part of the yes to this is, yes, poverty is a terrible thing if you live in it. And people can be, lives improved as their material circumstances are improved.
Yeah.
But when this then becomes sort of a goal or the primary reason that you see sin in the world, the answer then is to give people more stuff, allow them to have more consumer choice, allow them to, do these things. And we start to see now the redemption. So the redemption really is the market to just grow and be free.
Yep.
People to have more stuff, more individual freedom, more consumer choice to be able to sort of self-create. And in some ways, part of this is also it sees in the sin that part of the problem was it was reacting to what happened in the 20th century, Nazism, communism, societies turned upside down, fighting in the streets. So it's also part of the solution is if you give people more stuff, they're not going to want to get too religious or too political.
Yeah, okay.
So, yeah. And ultimately the question, what is when worshipped? It's money, mammon, the god of money. And in many ways, I think it's also the self.
Yeah.
So this enshrines the self, and I would say a form of the self, the consumer self-creating self who, in this vision, just wants to get back to their life where we could just travel anywhere in the world, do what the heck we want anytime. That's the liberal vision. The world is there to be your mall.
Yes. Yeah. And so there's no need for anything outside yourself because you can keep buying all you need to fulfill yourself.
Yes.
Yeah. Good times, apparently, but potentially not. So shall we move on?
Yeah.
To another one? Critical theory.
Yes.
Oh, the great buzzword at the moment.
The buzzword of the moment. So in many ways, critical theory, we could see some of the ones that come after this responding to what people see are the failures of liberalism. Critical theory is obviously something that's become more popular. It comes out of a bunch of we've done podcasts on this before, but just to catch everyone up, it's a set of responses, a critique, if you like, of really, in many ways, how the West worked. And so its question is, what is sin? It would then say sin is oppressive thoughts, oppressive hidden forms of power. Liberalism comes and gives freedom to people. But then one of the questions is, well, why does injustice and why does oppression and why does prejudice still continue?
Yeah.
When legislation has been made that people can be free. So, for example, if there were laws like in apartheid South Africa or in Australia, with Indigenous people, or in the United States with African American people, once those laws are gone, but then injustice still continues. Why is that so?
Yes.
So, part of this is that, therefore, that what there is there's hidden sources of power. And in a sense, the majority has created a hidden system of power that still continues to linger even within a liberal democratic state.
Yeah.
So this could be the patriarchy, or this could be, racism, and these forms still exist there systematically. Now, what's really interesting is that people talk about structural oppression, which, yes, there are elements there, but interestingly, it doesn't so much look at structure. So, for example, housing, or it doesn't look at school zoning as much as it looks at more attitudes that people have.
Yes, yes.
Again, there's different levels of how people buy into this.
Yeah.
So redemption then naturally that would flow on. That redemption is the defeat of that locus of oppression within the culture. So that structures and thoughts and systems and ways of thinking that actually then oppress people, when they are destroyed and undermined, therefore, in a sense, that's what is sort of redemption. And Herbert Marcuse, who was one of the sort of critical theorists, he talked about the sort of minority then gaining rule over the majority. So you see that now, that desire to, in a campaign, a fashion show, instead of in the past, it was to have these super beautiful people who, not many people look like them, now to have a much wider variety where you have different minorities, and to continually sort of find new minorities as well.
Yeah, okay.
So in a sense, what's then worship? It's really hard because in some sense, critical theory is, in a sense, it's an anti. It's critical by its very nature, so it's coming against something.
Yes.
But I still think there's elements of what's worshipped. Often the experience of the oppressed is worshipped and held up as the defining thing for everything.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I would say the sort of minority. But part of what happens is, again, this ends up at a different kind of individualization, not like liberalism, but it just continues this continual fracturing. I remember reading about this one particular conference in the United States, and I think it was a feminist conference. And they sort of broke people up into different minority groups to treat those minorities, according to this sort of thought, but it just kept going, and it went for like 2 days or something, and it kept going to the point of, and there were groups like people who experience hay fever, and it just, it sort of
would have been in that group.
I'd be there.
Yeah.
Well,
but then we'd be split up further.
Yeah. So that's the idea that
we wouldn't have ended up in the same group anyway. I wouldn't have thought.
No, I probably would have.
I would have put you in that group. No, I don't know.
Same birth date.
Same birthday. Hay fever, addicted to pastries. So, that's essentially, really, I guess the religious ideas behind that concept.
Okay. Well, moving from there to nationalism.
Yeah. So, and to these two very much, a lot in the news, we had a lot of people ask us about nationalism.
We have, yeah.
And one of the things that's happened is, critical theory, I think came, it's been around for ages, but really came sort of into the public imagination, particularly in the sort of cultural, particularly in the US, but also other places.
Yeah.
And some of the responsibility in that has then this backlash, conservative backlash, as people sort of almost in reaction, gone in the opposite direction. And that's one thing to remember. One of the great sort of rules is, I said this, continual rebuilders will continue to say it. If you're worried about critical theory, the danger for you is less that you're going to wake up tomorrow as an extreme critical theorist, but you're going to wake up further down the road of a reaction against it.
Yeah.
If you're a liberal and like the first vision of things going back to normal and the world as a mall, again, you're not going to wake up a nationalist necessarily tomorrow.
Yeah.
So nationalism in some sense is this reaction where the scope of seeing the world in liberalism of globalization as this place of freedom where you can move around, similar, but it's just on a smaller scope. It's the nation.
Yeah. Okay.
And in many ways, it sort of holds up the values of a particular place of geography, its culture, its people. Some forms of nationalism are tied to race, others are not. But its sin is foreignness.
Yeah. Okay.
It locates sin outside of the nation. It's about those outside of the nation putting pressure upon the nation. And you see this, you may see a country like Poland who has had a history of oppression, from a bigger country like Russia being next to it. But most of those stories then are told around the people who came from outside in and actually caused the problems.
Yeah, okay.
And so then sometimes sin will be still located within the nation, but it's those who are treasonous. There's the term a fifth column.
Yeah, okay.
And you look at Jewish people's history in Europe and other places continually suffering from this. There was a sense that they were seen as others even when they were part of the nation.
Yeah, yeah.
You look at what happened in Nazi Germany. You had Jews who had been there for centuries and centuries, many of whom had converted to Christianity, had taken on German names, many of whom were super nationalistic, had fought in World War I.
Yes.
But when nationalism arises, there's this deep drive to find who are those who are not living according to the national goals, and to tie that into the story and culture of that nation. And so a lot of nationalism as emerges, particularly sort of in the 19th and 18th centuries, really was a reaction to the sort of rise of liberalism and capitalism in Europe. And you had this thing that in a lot of the major capitals of Europe, like Budapest and these different places, there were a lot of traders. So you had a Jewish population, German population, French, English, Dutch. And often it was then people in the countryside who may, speak Latvian or Polish or Lithuanian. And so there was this move to almost push back on the rise of capitalism and what was seen as cosmopolitanism, and get back to this sort of like the true, and all this language comes up around the people, the Volk, the folk, or, soil, blood and soil.
Yeah.
And you see that there's this almost religious understanding of the land and people's blood and all this sort of stuff. So,
very much linked to identity.
Very much linked to identity. So, and sort of the fear was that cosmopolitanism and globalization and capitalism would rob us of our identity because we move from where we grew up to the city and we can reinvent ourselves and anyone can get ahead. And someone who's poor can make a lot of money and find themselves in the upper class. So you see this interesting reaction against it from the upper class. And even interesting, early British conservatism or Toryism wasn't necessarily pro-market because they were actually resentful of people who had made a bunch of money from the lower classes. You get these terms like the nouveau riche. They'd look down on them. And then you also had it coming up from the ground as well, from the working class. So it comes from two sides. But really, redemption then is patriotism. But you get this fascinating sort of Christianized, almost sacrifice of self in war. And worship of the military and those who sacrifice for the country, spilt blood for the fatherland, the motherland. It's this interesting way that sort of weaves into this redemptive myth that some have called it the myth of redemptive violence, that when we spill blood, our blood on the land, that almost has these echoes of, or spill our blood maybe in a foreign land for our country, that it's almost this form of atonement. What we see on the cross. Yes, it has all these theological characteristics. And what happens is, what's worshipped, it's the nation.
Yeah.
And, all different countries have them. It could be Night of the Proms in Royal Albert Hall in England, and it could be, America, you walk around Washington, D.C., France, all these things around the revolution in Paris. It can be Australia. You see the Anzac myth in different places and in New Zealand as well. Lots of different countries have this concept of civil religion, these ceremonies which look religious but aren't.
Yes.
Or have maybe part religion, part the state.
I find it interesting that nationalism is still so enduring in a increasingly globalized world. And I wonder, particularly in reference to what we talked about last week with the metaverse, what will nationalism potentially look like when that space emerges more? Will it still look the same? Will it take on a new kind of thing? I don't know. This is just thoughts I'm having out loud.
I think we're seeing that because, increasingly China is behind a firewall. There is a Chinese internet.
Yes.
And you'll have people in Melbourne who live on the Chinese internet, which is really fascinating. Yeah. So you got people who may order an Uber, but there's other people who order a DD. There may be people who buy stuff on Amazon, other people who order stuff on Alibaba, some people who go on Twitter, others who go on Weibo. there's a Russian language sort of internet. There's a Portuguese, Brazilian. So there's interesting that there's language based around the internet, but also that I think there will be actually separate internets and separate metaverses that will reflect national, ideas. Because you think, how will Eastern Europe, the Russian speaking internet has effect there, and in the Orthodox countries. So I think we're going to see it definitely play out. And then interesting, even how the internet has driven, and this thing of driven these different, so even the nation can split down. So you're seeing in the US, I just saw there's someone's proposing New California, which is California without San Francisco and LA. There's even now on Twitter there's the Victorian Independence Movement, which is just fascinating, is now sort of grown. You get hats now, Victorian Independence for our state here in Victoria, because there's this frustration they feel like hard done by the rest of Australia in politics, Cape Town in South Africa arguing about, there's people who want to break away from the rest of South Africa. All across the world, you're seeing this movement. So it's fascinating that we're seeing this thing of like these big sweeps, like the metaverse, globalization, at the same time, nationalism and regionalism. Yeah, again, why? Responses against the failings of secularism.
Yeah.
And Pope John Paul II wrote an interesting book, and he talked about there's still just as we have a affinity to our family, you have an affinity to your nation, where you're from, your region. And that's, again, there's a yes in that. I am totally Australian, and I'll be in California and I'll see a gum tree, and it's like, you have this, because we're connected to the land in some ways, and to the culture and everything. And so there's an element where there's a yes, that's actually okay. Yes. And Scripture does talk about the different cultures and nations of the world bringing their treasures to the kingdom, to the city of God. But again, the no is when that becomes an end in itself, when that's trying to play the role of what only God and Christianity can do.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Utilitarianism.
It's a really interesting one, and it's probably one that I think is particularly relevant for us here in Australia and New Zealand, but in other places around the world. And one thing you'll notice is, I've talked about before that, Australia's New Zealand's response to the pandemic has seen people in the US and parts of Europe like, what on earth's going on there? And, often the comparison is, it's communism, socialism. But really what people often fail to understand is that in sort of Anglo-American thought, or particularly Anglo-British philosophy and political science, you've got these two wings. And one is the story that's told by people like John Locke and Thomas Paine, which is the idea that before government, before civilization, people lived in this state of freedom, in this natural state, and they had these inalienable natural rights.
Yeah.
And so when government comes along, therefore, the government is there to do certain things, but also it's to protect those rights. And if there's too much government, it's going to impinge on those natural rights. That's very much the American story. That's enshrined in, the Constitution. And John Locke, writing around that time influences, that sort of thought and so on. And so when people look at something like Australia, they're like, oh my goodness, they're taking away their freedom. It's not the government's role to take away people's natural freedom. But then later on, about 100 years later, particularly as Australia and New Zealand is more formed, there's another thinker who's really influential. There's people like John Stuart Mill, but there's also Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was a philosopher, and he's one of the sort of fathers of this thought called utilitarianism. His thought is, it's not about individual rights. It's not about an individual having their rights. It's actually about the majority experiencing the most pleasure. Okay. And there doesn't exist this perfect time before civilization where people had natural rights. The creation of government actually guarantees your rights.
Yeah.
And so government is not here to take away your freedom. Government actually gives you freedom. And Bentham, was someone who, was not religious, looked at animal rights, looked at things like, the ability of people to not have to be married, and a lot of his stuff, in terms of sexual rights and, all the stuff that you see today. He was, in a sense, in many ways, quite an early adopter with a lot of those thoughts. And so it's a very different way of looking at things where government's not bad and government's not here to take away your individualism. Government is here to ensure your individualism and your individual freedom. And so this is where you see this different understanding. It's more about the greatest good versus individual rights. So this is why you see in Australia and New Zealand this very different response to the pandemic, where pandemic comes and people's fear, say in the US, is, the government's going to come and they're going to overreach and they're going to make us have masks and vaccine mandates.
We're doing well today.
We are. What's going on? We didn't have pastries.
Yeah.
It's just a disaster.
I'm fine over here.
Okay. Well, yeah, exactly.
All right, stay pastry man.
Yes. So the fear is the government is going to come in and overreach. Now, in Australia, the vast majority of the population is more, we want the government to control the pandemic. We want minimum deaths. We want a super effective vaccine rollout. We want to be protected from this bad thing because in a utilitarian framework, you have an expectation of high competency from the government. The government gives you your rights. The government ensures a good life.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. There's a book, I can't remember if I mentioned this recently on the podcast, but there's a book written by the New York Times bureau chief, Sydney, American who came to Sydney and lived here. And he's reflecting on the difference between Australian and American culture. And he says, Americans want to be great. Australians want a great life. And I thought that sums up this differentiation here. So in a sense, in America, it's the government's role to get out of the way and enable you to become great.
Yes.
In Australia, the government is going to guarantee you a great life. So I want to have a house with 2 kids and a backyard and barbecues with my mates and be able to go to the football and go to the beach when I want and go on an overseas holiday and drive a car and do what the heck I want. But it's actually the government who's going to make that happen.
Yes.
Where in America, it's more seen the government's going to come and tax me and take that away. Well, we'll be more happy to pay taxes because, and there's some similarities here to Scandinavia and so on. So not often named, but really key. And Stanley Hauerwas, the theologian, was the person who helped me sort of understand that difference, not personally, but reading something he wrote where, he talked about Jeremy Bentham. Interestingly for you, Daniel, Jeremy Bentham wanted to come to South Australia and set up a sort of like utilitarian, utopian community, if you like, in the colony, which is interesting. He did. Wow.
It was your home.
Yeah, it was my house.
Yeah.
I was the ruler.
Yes. So it's interesting, again, to pull it. So Australians will go, look at the individuals who are letting everyone down and get frustrated with them that they're ruining everyone else's, lifestyle.
Yes.
It's really interesting. So again, looking at this through the lens of a critique, biblical critique is, what is sin? Well, sin in utilitarianism is incompetency, incompetent government. When the government can't give you this great lifestyle, and Bentham saw that really almost sin, because he got rid of religion, almost sin, what it was bad feelings. When lots of people are having bad experiences. So again, the pandemic comes and Australia does these things like lockdown, locks out people, and was willing to lock out Australians overseas. I remember the Prime Minister was like, Aussies overseas, you got a few weeks to get back because we're going to lock this thing down.
Yeah.
Because it's like, well, we're willing for a minority to pay the price for the majority to have pleasurable feelings. You look at Western Australia, our state, which has locked itself off and is willing to be locked down well into 2022. And the leader is extremely popular because the people are going, well, we want to be protected from the bad thing.
Yeah.
So, corona. So sin in a sense is bad feelings, bad things. And we hate it when the government is incompetent or doesn't have a plan. So you look at our country, we've had one of the most successful vaccine rollouts in the world. We're about to hit 94% or something in our state. We could get to 94% as a nation. Canberra is 100% vaccinated now, our city. And people are still complaining that it wasn't done super efficiently. So that's a classic example of utilitarianism. What's redemption? Competency, and the government creating an environment and the community that we can all enjoy ourselves.
Yeah.
Competency is a great barbecue where everyone brings all the right stuff and, the weather's great. How good is this, mate?
Yeah.
Look at the weather.
Clean beaches, roads that don't have potholes in them.
Exactly. This is why you see this high level of transformation of public spaces in Australia, because that's what you want. Beautiful parks, football, running smoothly. I got in, had my beer. It's all great. That's what redemption is in this. It's the great lifestyle.
Just quickly, just going back to what is sin, you talk about incompetency with the government. Is that also true of thinking about each other, of society in general?
Yes, I think so. So there's this element that I think you look at the person who's ruining it for everyone. So the person who comes on a train has got their radio on loud.
My
it's
goodness.
Like, pull your head in, mate, is the Australian thing. Where in other countries it might be that person's got their individual freedom, look what they're doing.
Yeah.
You have this weird thing in Australia where, and people again too, I remember the footage of the guy in Sydney who had COVID, and in the Sydney lockdown, he was like, went on the run. And overseas, he was on Fox News, and people were like, this is terrible. This man is, being told by the government to lock down, and they're chasing him. Look at the individual rights of this guy.
Yeah.
In Australia, it was like, get that guy. And when he was arrested, it was literally like all the people in the apartments came into the street and applauded, because it's like, mate, you're ruining it for us.
Yeah.
We're willing to do lockdown. Because we can see on the other side of this barbecues. And you see how our government's talking now. It's not like we can see
on the other side
barbecues. It's true. It's literally like, it's like, I have the Melbourne Cup and Christmas is going to be awesome and you'll be back at the beach and holidays. This is Australia, sort of New Zealand. I think New Zealand as well, sort of way of looking at things. So what's worshipped? Pleasure.
Yeah.
And
good
barbecues.
times. Yeah, good feelings, good times.
Yeah.
Good vibes. That's Australia.
Totally.
I think the Men in Clark thing, the Australians sort of barbecuing, he had some line about, Australia's sort of, barbecuing on the beach waiting for the apocalypse sort of thing, yeah.
And a lot of it, like, it feels very nostalgic. Like, you think back to your childhood, Christmas with the family, and like there's just a lot of nostalgia around like those barbecues, summer, beaches, and kind of a bit of harken back to the good old days. Let's bring that now.
Well, look at us in the podcast. I'm going to critique us, But you look in Melbourne. What do? We get together. We have food.
Yeah,
we talk about the food. We have, you muck around your jokes. Everyone feeling good. We've had, jokes where, listen to podcasts from other countries like, okay, today we're doing this. Boom, boom, boom. Where we're like, we've got a paste, we've got our coffees. How you feeling, guys? Have a bit of a laugh. Good vibes. All right, let's get into it.
Yeah.
So there you go, rest of the world. We're critiquing ourselves in real time.
I'll reflect on that later. Are you ready to move on to
where are we
one?
having lunch? Sorry.
We haven't talked about that. I'm a bit hungry. Libertarianism.
Yes. Okay. So this is a huge one in the world and growing. And again, you could describe libertarianism as liberalism, but more extreme.
Yeah. Okay.
So libertarianism is often associated with the thinker Ayn Rand, who was a emigre/refugee from the Soviet Union, from a family in St. Petersburg, comes to America and almost goes in the opposite direction, where this is what we were talking about before, but in extreme.
Yeah.
It's not that everyone, so liberalism might say, hey, we want to have this equitable thing where everyone is able to have their natural rights.
Yep.
Libertarianism is more like, we want those who are naturally more gifted, naturally more entrepreneurial, to be able to do their thing and not be encumbered by the state, but also not be encumbered by the weak.
Yeah, okay.
So, Ayn Rand, famously talked against altruism and care of other people. So where liberalism might go, we want to have the markets, but we also want some welfare here just to protect those who could be vulnerable. Libertarianism would see that as bad. Any regulation is bad. And sort of, Ayn Rand communicated her philosophy. She had a circle in New York, which included the former head of the US Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, probably one of the most influential economists, or someone with their hands on the levers of the economy in the last sort of 20, 30 years. But she also did these novels and, Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead. And in that, there's this idea of that this guy, John Galt, who disappears and goes off and leaves society. What would happen if the most talented amongst us got sick of being regulated and held back by the masses and just went off, and all the best people in the world go to Galt's Gulch. It's this wonderful place out there somewhere where they can do their thing. Now, really interesting, this is a hugely influential philosophy in America. Again, this clashes very much with utilitarianism, and this is why you don't see many copies of Ayn Rand in Australia and New Zealand. I'd not really heard of her until I went to America, and almost every bookstore had it there. And essentially it's this idea that also is very foundational to Silicon Valley. If you think about the vision of Silicon Valley, it's on the Western frontier. San Francisco had the 60s revolution. So it's the sort of soil that Silicon Valley exists upon is sort of three things. It's the sort of hippie utopianism of the 60s that happened in Haight-Ashbury in California. Secondly, it's sort of Ayn Rand, extreme libertarianism, extreme capitalism, and then technological. innovation and advance.
Yeah.
And you see this. So the metaverse could be argued as sort of a libertarian frontier. These ideas of these sort of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Peter Thiel and Mark Zuckerberg, these characters, they're very much like sort of Ayn Rand, John Galt's characters. They've gone off and, there's even been people suggest, that California should secede from the rest of the United States and just be its own thing. Or you look at Elon Musk's dream to go to Mars and create sort of this new civilization there. All of this is actually really libertarianism. What's different is libertarian, there's this really interesting moment, and one of the stories about conservatism, you have an older conservatism, which is more about, how do we protect the nuclear family? How do we sort of have sexual morals and personal responsibility? And, how do we sort of keep religion and all that sort of stuff? Really interesting. You got this uneasy truce between that sort of social conservatism and libertarianism. So really, if you look at something like the Republican Party in the US, and you could even argue the Conservative Party in the UK, the ascendant force is libertarian in the midst of a party which is sometimes more socially conservative.
Yeah, okay.
And so libertarians are different to conservatives in the sense that they're often, not all of them, but many are anti-religion. And Ayn Rand was a strong atheist. But then also whereas the social conservative might want to ban pornography or ban abortion, the libertarians just don't ban anything, legalize drugs, legalize everything. So there's this really interesting moment that almost what you're seeing with the Republican Party and a figure like Donald Trump is naturally much more a libertarian more than he is a social conservative. If you look at his life, he may say some of the talking points. So really what you're seeing around the world is the emergence of libertarianism. And I would say a sort of populist libertarianism, one of the most influential political thinkers in the world. And I say that's a caveat about 12 times 8 is Joe Rogan. And I'm not saying he's a good political thinker, but his sort of populist, everyman kind of libertarianism is super influential in the world, super influential. And, you're seeing what's happening is I think there's a lot of people who formerly would have seen themselves on the left or seen themselves as liberals who are reacting to what they see now as the authoritarian tone of some elements of the culture where critical theory has taken hold and are now swinging to not conservatism per se, or they might start to call themselves conservatives, but really libertarianism. And so it's this reaction against any kind of authoritarianism of left or right. It is hugely influential. So one of the sort of real tells around libertarianism is the word freedom. And, people asking for freedom.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about, again, we've just sort of set out the sort of utilitarianism of Australia and New Zealand. I heard a really interesting sort of little podcast by a guy from Canada, and he talked about, I think, Canada has elements of utilitarianism and other different cultural and political streams than the United States. But what he's saying is you got sort of 80-90% of Canada who still is very trusting of the government, has that viewpoint, that sort of utilitarian viewpoint. But then you got this 10% who are more influenced by the United States through social media, through the internet, and not just the United States, but the libertarian wing of the United States. That's what you're seeing in Australia. This is why in Australia, at the protests currently happening in our city, at the protests happening in a place like Wellington in New Zealand, you've got people with Trump flags, and you've got sort of a very energized libertarianism that is moving around the world. In Scandinavia, which is very libertarian in terms of it's got its classic sort of social democracy. You've got young entrepreneurs who are reading Ayn Rand as sort of this pushback against the sort of Yantalaw culture that they live in. So libertarianism. Okay, so what is sin? Restraints outside of the individual that are restraining the individual. Regulation. And I would say the non-performing, the non-elite, the weak, very much so. Anyone telling you what to do. And, what is redemption? Well, redemption's freedom from restraints and regulation. Again, talked before about Isaiah Berlin has two concepts of freedom from, if you like, and freedom to. So it could be, I'm in North Korea, I want freedom from the regime, putting me in prison. Versus freedom to is, well, I want to walk around town dressed as an armadillo and fire a water pistol at people.
Okay,
that literally just came from my subconscious.
Right? That was
just then.
That was a beautiful moment. Can someone please illustrate that?
Yes,
send it through.
I don't think. No, don't. I'm going to get utilitarian on you. Don't please.
An armadillo with a water pistol.
Well, me as an armadillo with a water pistol.
Oh no, I'm imagining a real armadillo.
I was going Mark's.
With Mark's face on it.
Yeah. Hey, it's my illustration. I'll cry if I want to. So in a sense, it's this escape from others. Also, freedom too. So you think about like Burning Man Festival as a classic example of this sort of like we're just going to go out in the desert and do what the heck we want, sort of thing. And what is worshipped? Well, freedom in the self.
Yeah, okay.
But freedom goes from something of freedom from to a license to do whatever. So freedom becomes the God, which is really interesting.
Whew. Well, this next one and the last one is more of an emerging one, right? Yeah. So you've called it conspiracy theorism. Is that a title that you've come up with yourself?
I just came up with that this morning.
Yeah, great.
Hadn't had a pastry. So, yeah. So I feel like there's this conspiracy theories have been around for a while and there has been different levels of conspiracy theory. So in a sense, you may have the kind of conspiracy theory where people go, look, the shooting of JFK. Yep. Was it really just Lee Harvey Oswald acting as a lone wolf? It may be about one particular incident. Mm-hmm. The sort of Canadian journalist written a lot about conspiracy theories, Peter Dale Scott, has this concept, what he calls the parapolitical, which is more the idea that there are certain, particular intelligence agencies which will do stuff that we don't find out till years later. Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of this idea that there's parts of the political sphere that we don't know about. Deals done, did Australia and Indonesia sign an oil deal behind East Timor's back? Timor-Leste, that sort of stuff. So it's a mistrust of the political system. And, so he would look at the Lee Harvey Oswald thing, and I think his theory is Lee Harvey Oswald may have shot him, but there was actually something else going on where the CIA was trying to flush out this spy and sent Lee Harvey Oswald to, Russia as this agent, and that's why they're covering up. It's less because there's this massive conspiracy as there's something that certain people want to hide. There's that sort of concept. But what we're seeing is this new kind of almost, I would say, religion of conspiracy theorism emerging. And it's got a number of influences, but it's increasingly taking on a kind of religious form. I think QAnon has been an example of this. So, for example, I think it was 2 weeks ago, what's happened in the QAnon world is that obviously there was a lot of prophecies and stuff around Trump being re-inaugurated into power. Hasn't happened, and it's gone into really interesting and slightly strange places. So one of the theories from QAnon was that John F. Kennedy Jr., John F. Kennedy's son, was actually going to emerge. He died in a plane crash with his, I think, fiancée at the time. I can't remember if they were married or not. And they were this, high society sort of figures. As Seinfeld fans, he appears in a couple of episodes, or this one where Elaine has this crush on him. And so there's this belief that he was going to appear and be Trump's running mate. So that was running during this sort of election. But what's happened since then is a couple of weeks ago, there was this Q prophecy, not from Q, but Q stopped posting. So it's sort of like taking on this self-fulfilling form where people put something into this sort of online open source conspiracy movement that actually John F. Kennedy Jr. was going to reappear at Dealey Plaza, the exact place where John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Texas, and it would almost be this appearance of this messianic figure. He was actually, and some went as far to say he will not just become the president of America. So Trump's almost starting to become peripheral in the QAnon movement, that he would then become the king or something, either the president or king of like Australia, Canada, United Kingdom, America. And literally thousands of people turned up and they were lining the streets and they started counting down till midday and then did the Pledge of Allegiance at midday, hoping for this messianic figure to appear. And so some of this stuff you see, and particularly some of the QAnon stuff around this satanic cabal of pedophiles. We've had some quite disturbing scenes here in our state in Victoria where out the front of Parliament there was a gallows appear twice. Part of that links back to this QAnon idea that when the storm comes, which is almost this moment of reckoning, this apocalyptic day, that actually the evil, satanic, pedophilic elites of the world will be hung. and the justice, the Trump or whoever, John F. Kennedy Jr., whatever figures that you believe in will hang these people. Now, what's really interesting is QAnon's this movement, but you're seeing the filtering down of these ideas. So often what you have in something like this is there's the full-on believers, and it's big. When we have spoken about QAnon on the podcast, we've had people, even in places like Australia and others, who have emailed us and have family members who have fully become enveloped in this. So this is very real. There are Christian leaders who have been influenced by this, and it's gone into churches and so on. But you're almost seeing now this sort of like emerging political force. So that in New Zealand, when they had the protest the other day, you have that influence there. And, it's going global. In Japan, there was marches, to reinstate the former sacked chief of American intelligence, Michael Flynn. So you're seeing this sort of mashup of a few things. I would say it's libertarianism. There's some radical libertarianism there. There's also some social conservatism in there. There's also some apocalyptic religious belief. That's been true. Some Christian belief. We've seen there's now Q-evangelicals, they call them. Evangelicals affected by Q.
So like end times kind of
stuff.
Yeah.
There's also fusions that we're seeing globally amongst the Persian community, where you've seen this sort of mix-up of some sort of Persian thought and even Shia thought and some of this sort of stuff. So again, some of the apocalyptic stuff about the Mahdi coming back and Q and so on. And then you've sort of also got this sort of nationalism mixed up in it. So there's this something new is brewing around the world, whether it's a protest you see in Germany, some of the sovereign citizen stuff you've seen in America, but also now seeing in Australia, New Zealand, places like Germany and the, I forgot what they call them, Freiburgers, Reichsburgers, I think they call them. So really interesting. That's gotten into anti-vaccine stuff and so on. So the anti-vaxxer thing as well. Now, as much as that's a sort of more marginal thing, it's getting bigger, but it's going down to cultures. Even statements like do your own research. You hear people saying now, that's actually from the American conspiracy theorist William Cooper, who was killed by the FBI in a raid on his compound. So this idea that really, to sort of take it apart, what is sin? An evil elite. There is an evil elite who controls everything in the world. And it's a cabal. And they're really the hands moving sovereignly behind everything happening in the world. So again, this is a religious dimension of explaining the world. What is redemption? Well, freedom from restraint and regulation and the defeat of the evil elite. So there'll be this apocalyptic day of the Lord, if you like to use the biblical language, coming where the apocalyptic reveals the workings. And again, apocalypse is revealing.
Yeah, okay.
The term in the Greek. So we'll see the corrupt in the swamp drain. The swamp will be drained. The corrupt leaders at the head of the Vatican and the UN and the World Bank and the US and Australia, whatever, the royal family, they'll be revealed for the sort of pedophiles and satans that they really are. And so it's almost a secularized civil religion kind of end times theology, as you're right to point out.
Yeah.
And spiritual warfare. Really interesting, sort of this mainstream spiritual warfare. I mean, I saw a video the other day of this woman in a school meeting in California, I think it was, and she took to this school board about they wanted to bring in masks, and she's like, I know what you are. You're demons. You're spiritual demons.
Yeah.
But then she just went off tap and is like dropping F-bombs. And I recognize that spiritual warfare language, but sort of done by people who may not be regularly attending a church. And what's worship? What's a mashup of stuff? It's the nationalism, sort of different faiths in there, libertarianism, the New Age movement, veganism. This is all sort of wellness movements all coming in there. That's my series of contemporary ideologies.
The diagnosing of the culture. That was a mammoth effort.
I know.
I
know.
So I guess what you've endeavoured to do through that is demonstrate how to diagnose culture, how to go through and look at these ideologies through a biblical framework.
Yes. And what I'd encourage people to do is you don't even have to go and repeat them. This is more a learning.
Yes.
Instead of this is content to go and repeat them in your next sermon. But look where you are. You're going to have all of these going on in your church. Maybe not all of them, but some of them.
Yeah.
And I think this is part of the problem. Like it used to be, what do I preach to? I remember early on there's like you're preaching to the Christians in your congregation, but there may be unchurched people there as well.
Yes.
So how do you preach for them both? But now you've got all of this happening.
Yeah.
And so you're almost having to do this thing of I remember Timothy Keller talking about, in New York, he's preaching to someone who might be a a non-practicing Jew. It might be someone who's an atheist, someone who's a lapsed Catholic. There's multiple different people. You need to think like that now. But almost with all of them, practice the thing. What's the sin? Okay, well, what does the Bible say about sin?
Yes.
Again, all of these are going to have yeses and nos. There's elements where there is truths in elements, or there's things that are yes, but then there's also big no's. There's often there are things that we don't know about as the public, obscured, and have there been conspiracies throughout history? There's times where there has, but therefore then when that runs into the answer in of itself, that's when we get wrong. We go into really bad places. So I would encourage people, see your call as a missionary, even if you've never left your hometown.
Yep.
Do your own contextual theology. I don't mean make up stuff, but more that missiological engagement with this stuff. How does the biblical story, which is the one true story, speak into all of these things and critiques them? Jesus' death on the cross means that we don't have to atone, in our own strength, through the market or people spilling blood in a war that may not be justified. All of these things. I think this is the way forward is with what's coming towards us. And in 5 years, we might redo this, and there could be like 7 more things that no one's even thought about now, or that are on the fringes of the internet that become mainstream. But I think the task is deconstructing these ideologies with the yes and the no of the gospel, and pointing people towards the gospel, because again, all of these are going to fail. My concern is that the one that we will see growing perhaps in 5 years is nihilism. That when people go, man, I was pushing the critical theory thing, or I thought the market was going to save us, or I believed all these conspiracy theories and now I'm just this lone person isolated from my friends and family. I think there's a point where all of them fall short of the glory of God. And that's a gospel opportunity to speak out the truth of the one true story and the one true Lord over the entire universe, Jesus, and also to live out kingdom alternatives to this stuff. At the end of the day, ideologies are ideas. What we get to live out is the ecclesiology of the church, where people come and experience grace, come and experience the life of Jesus. That's our hope. That's what we're called to do. We've got the Holy Spirit empowering us to do this task. Don't be intimidated. This is what the church has always done. And I'm actually really hopeful if people do this for the future of the church.
Yeah, super encouraging. And I'm going to end it on that note. Thanks so much, Mark. Thanks, Daniel. See you next time.
See ya.